Now, if you think that today the academics are a problem, you have absolutely no idea just how much of cheeky little shits students could have been in the past. So much so that oftentimes peasants would actually riot just to manage to kill them. And one of these riots is called the Saint Scholastica Day. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to truly understand as how you can take a young man, usually the age of 13 to 14, and make him into the absolute symbol of pure, unadulterated hatred for the lowborn. You see, back in 1300, the universities were quite different than what we have today. There was no welfare, and there was no idea that you have to go to a university in order to avoid doing the jobs that nobody wants to do. No, going to university usually had nothing to do with your intellectual capacity, although that sometimes was later on taken into account. Going to a university was all to do with the wealth and the family prestige that you come from. Kind of like when you take your dog to a dog sitter, like they want to know that it's a good dog and play well with others. So basically you had to be a Christian, and not just any Christian, like none of the heresies outside of Catholicism was allowed. But also it would definitely matter if your father was a highborn, so a noble of prestige, or you could actually come from a burgher, like a middle class type of person that's wealthy enough in order to have secured you a patron, usually someone associated with the church or another noble. But regardless, you also had to be obscenely wealthy. Because again, this is a time where you don't have trains and you don't have airplanes carrying people around. So everything, including the journey as well as the actual kids staying there, had to be paid for. So they had to pay for every single meal that they had. They had to pay for the firewood that they used in order to warm themselves up. Had to pay for clothing. Had to pay for basically everything. And again, in a medieval society, prices were a lot higher than they are today because they usually didn't have the technology to make stuff cheaper. Now, for the students themselves, lives at the university was an absolute hell. Just so you can understand, imagine a place that's built out of stone in minus 15 degrees winter. University didn't give a shit. You still had to wake up and you still had to go to lecture at 5 a.m. Yes, like the first lecture was actually at 5 a.m. and it was done in complete darkness. Again, they didn't have electricity. Like, when people think of the past, you just need to think like how many things we take for granted. So, you would go into complete darkness and you'd wonder how would they take notes. They didn't. They didn't have like the same amount of paper and ball pens that we have now. They had vellum. It was expensive. So, you just sat there at 5 a.m. listening to Aristotelian logic being dictated to you in Latin. And that was just the start. You then have to go pray. You were allowed to then have breakfast, which you had to cook yourself. And after that, you actually started, well, the academic hours. Now, this was very militaristic. It was ran kind of like a monastery. Extreme levels of discipline all around. And so you'd wonder, like, well, how can this pious place, how can this bastion of order produce some of the biggest pieces of shit in human history? Well, you gotta understand how the system functioned. First of all, like, this was a multiculturalist utopia for the time. You see, in this university, you would have Englishmen, you would have Frenchmen, you would have Germans, and you'd have other people. And so stereotypes and insults would fly all around. One person by the name of Jacques de Vitry actually described some of these bitter ethnic conflicts. The students were heard throwing crude stereotypes towards the English, saying that all of them are drunkards. The French were effeminate, the Germans were considered furious and obscene, and the Lombards were avaricious and cowardly. Now, again, we do not talk about the world that had zero tolerance for bullying, or they would consider words as harm. We are talking about the world where words were unironically harm, because these people were kids of aristocrats, and they had to defend their honor. In other words, if you're not throwing hands, you're not defending your honor, and so your family now has to suffer. And I want you to understand what this means. Usually, the chimp out would not happen within the university, because that's a holy place. But the students would often go to taverns. Those weren't holy places. And so the chimp outs would usually happen in taverns. Now, as I mentioned before, the peasants had a huge disdain towards the students. And you'd have to wonder as to why that is. Well, you see, back then, they weren't considered average citizens. Because they were members of the university, they were considered clerics. And in Catholicism, the clerics operated by different laws. In other words, it was only a cleric that could judge another cleric. How many clerics do you think they were in the tavern in order to start judging? But the answer is not many, right? Because usually the dean was in the university. So if they went to a tavern and spurred out, well, the bailiff couldn't touch them. If you attacked them, it was being viewed as, well, attacking a holy man. And so a lot of class-based conflicts arose from this conundrum. Chimp outs were regular. Now, it doesn't mean that the university would always turn a blind eye, but again, the university was focused on, well, academic pursuits. And so, unless it was a grand chimp out, usually the university didn't really care. And it was also a problem of prestige. Like, imagine if a peasant came out and said, yeah, like, this student of yours groped my 15-year-old daughter. Well, now it's a he said, she said type of story, because all of the students would say that obviously it didn't happen. The peasant is imagining it, he's upset for such and such reasons. And so usually the head of the university would side with the students. And as you can imagine, this caused a little bit of animosity. Especially when a townswoman would be found dead and the bailiffs would get cock-blocked by the university. And so again, I'm not kidding, like university towns were extremely dangerous back then. To circle back as to what actually was the problem, I want you to imagine for a second a pious young man. Let's say he is 15, maybe 16 years old. He has managed to get through puberty, but unfortunately, he can't jerk off, ever. Like, he doesn't have a moment of solitude, right? There's no online pornography for him, there's no women around. He's basically forced to endure a life of piety and hardship, waking up at 5 a.m. and then going to studies and doing the works. On top of that, he is part of a noble family, so he has a reputation to uphold. And this is the age where young men, they try to establish social hierarchy. And so they try to dominate one another. Which means that oftentimes they will actually go around and start looking for trouble. So, you have the young man that's forced into a life of harsh and cruel discipline. He was associated to a nation within the academia itself, and he was also probably under some sort of seal and arms. So, for instance, Paris used the image of the seat of wisdom, Mary with the Christ child as the sigil, Oxford, a crowned virgin on a throne with the motto Dominus Illuminata Mea, Bologna had its own. And so you can understand like the number of things that the student was expected to chimp out over if anyone hurled an insult to any of these identities. And so when the student finally goes out, when he finally goes into a tavern, when the student who unironically believes that God is on his side because he understands theology much better than 90% of the human race, he actually knows Latin, he actually knows how to read the Bible, and on top of that, he is now in a place where the rules don't apply, and everyone else is a lowborn while he's a highborn, and finally no one is watching him. How do you think he's going to behave? Do you think he's going to party in moderation, or do you believe that he's going to be an absolute animal and a savage? And the answer is, well, it pretty much depends. Most of them probably weren't animals and savages, but some of them were. And some of them were enough in order to get the people to finally stop putting up with their shit. And so on the day of 10 February 1355, there was a grand feast day of Saint Scholastica. And you gotta understand, like, most peasants were already kind of pissed off about the obscene wealth and luxury that the universities were displaying. Sure, the students were poor, but usually when you had the graduation day, it was such an obscene display of wealth that it doesn't really do good for the optics in a medieval society that still suffers from famines and a little bit of income wealth inequality. And so the incident started inside a tavern where some students apparently insulted the barkeep and threw the wine in front of the barkeep's face, saying that the wine wasn't good enough. And so the townspeople started believing that the academic scholars aren't good enough either. And this caused a massive riot. Benches turned into shields. People started bringing clubs and axes. And the whole thing escalated when some of the students managed to make it back to the university and tell their friends what the townspeople are doing. So now you have like all of these young teenage boys that are sons of nobles, and they have a reputation to defend, and they decided to clash against the peasantry, which came out with bows and arrows. For around 3 days, the streets went red with the blood of both peasants and students. It turned into an absolute shit show of epic proportions. Now, you may wonder what was the reaction from this. Like, would the nobility finally realize that, well, maybe they should dial it a little bit down? Maybe, like, this is a problem of having, like, 2 legal systems, one for the students and one for the common folk. No, absolutely not. For the next 500 years, the church, which had absolute narrative control in that time, would force the bailiffs and the mayors of Oxford every single year for the next 500 years, I'm not kidding, the next 500 years, to hold a memorial for the students that died during the Oxford riot and to reassess the privileges that the university has. And again, this is not something particular to Oxford. In the medieval time, this was systemic at almost every single Catholic university in Europe. One of the reasons that Cambridge University was actually founded is because some of the scholars were chased away by the town people, and they had to set up shop someplace else.
Morning bells were laughing loud, velvet cloaks among the crowd, silver rings and scarlet gowns. We were born to own this town. Trumpets flare above the square, flags in Latin in the air, candles glow like crowns on fire. Every drunk chant climbing higher. Raise your cups to Scholastica. We were blessed to rule the night. Dale's bolt, we shout in Latin. Every clash a holy rite. Hold the line, Scholastica. Let the common rabble run. We were born with golden halos. We decide when day is done. Banquet tables turn to shields, broken benches, shattered fields, someone's liver on a pike, blood on books we used to like. Eyes are gone in feathered flight, arrows singing through the night. Still we grin with stained white gloves, claim it all as wrath from above. Hear the cobbler's children cry from the mud along the side. We just lift our crystal glass, say a prayer and march right past. Kiss, remember grace, know your station, know your place. God sits smiling in